very warm welcome to the Garde Ecossaise podcast. This is the official podcast of the Garde Ecossaise novels, hosted by me, Dr. Kirsty Mackenzie. The men in the book are entirely fictional, but the times and events they lived in are real. In this podcast, I will tease out fact from fiction for you, and in doing so, I hope to introduce you to this fascinating period of history. The book Garde Ecossaise is available to buy from Amazon, Kobo, Apple Books, Google Books, Waterstones in the UK, and Barnes & Noble in the US. It is also available from many different retailers in Europe. Please see the website www.legardeecossaise.net for further details. I am so glad that you have taken the time to join me as I discuss the novels in greater depth and the historical events which inspired them. This podcast is for those of you who are enjoying the novels and who want to learn that little bit more about the history behind the book. This podcast is also for students studying early modern history courses at college or university. Indeed, the novels purposefully cover many of the key events of the 17th century, events that are covered in many survey courses on the early modern period. I like to think of the book as a textbook for an early modern history course masquerading as a historical fiction novel. The podcasts will closely mirror the contents of each chapter in the novels and explore the real people and events mentioned within them. The podcast is also available as a videocast on YouTube with interesting and helpful visuals. There are also subtitles for those of you who are hard of hearing. You will find transcripts of these podcasts on the Garde Ecossaise blogs. Please visit the website at www.legardeecossaise.net to take a look. Let's begin today's episode. We are introduced to Garde Ecossaise by our narrator Robert Meldrum, who is the main voice of the novels. Meldrum becomes a member of the Guard in the 1670s and later becomes their notary and archivist. Meldrum is narrating the stories of Garde Ecossaise by going through the archives, which include mission reports, verbal testimonies and written correspondence. Meldrum has, in effect, compiled a diary and an account of Garde's actions. However, we are being shown hitherto private materials as this particular unit within Garde Ecossaise is a hidden elite unit who are tasked with combating and eliminating covert activities by the enemies of Louis XIV. We know that Meldrum provides us with a comprehensive memoir of John Hamilton's early life and times, from his birth in Ulster, his time living in the Scottish Highlands, his time as a soldier in the 30 Years' War, and finally his elevation to the inner circles of the French state under Cardinal Mazarin and King Louis XIV. Meldrum opens the novel by writing a justification for his publication of the journals of the Garde Ecossaise, entitled To the Reader. These were common in printed books during the 17th century and were usually an explanation as to why the author felt compelled to write the book. Sometimes it would include a dedication to the book's patron. From the outset, Meldrum reveals his reasons for writing the book, i.e. the adverse impact of the 1715 Jacobite Rebellion on the Franco-British relationship. Historian Daniel Secchi, who has written the most authoritative account of the rebellion, has called the 1715 Jacobite Rebellion the orphan child of the Jacobite risings. It certainly has been overshadowed by the more famous rising in 1745 to 1746. He goes on to comment that when compared to the protracted Jacobite War between 1689 and 1692, and the Jacobite Rising of 1745 to 46, the 1715 looks like a damp squib. However, although the 1715 Rising ultimately failed, the Rising should certainly not be written off or overlooked. Out of all the Jacobite Risings, the Rising in 1715 had the best chance of success, and the threat posed to the Hanoverian state was very real indeed. Effectively, Jacobites wanted to re-establish the former Stuart government and Stuart monarchy, which had been deposed by William of Orange in 1688. Thus, the 1715 Jacobite Rising renewed civil war across Britain and Ireland, and during the 15, families across the country chose their respective sides. The roots of the 1715 Rising in Scotland lie in the disenchantment with the 1707 Union, where economic benefits of the Union were slow in coming. In addition, there were those amongst the Scottish elite who genuinely resented the loss of Scotland's sovereignty and the abolition of its own parliament. In England, English Tories, the political party well disposed to the Jacobite cause, began to support the idea of a rising on the back of discontent with Whig policy and popular unrest in English society. On the 6th of September 1715, John Erskine, the Earl of Mar, raised the Jacobite standard in Braemar and declared King James III, the exiled Stuart monarch, to be the rightful king of Britain and Ireland. However, the 1715 rebellion failed because English Jacobites stood still and wanted foreign troops to do the fighting for them. This stood in contrast to the Scottish Jacobites, who had been gathering arms since the winter of 1714. But the Scottish side of the rising had its problems too. There was a failed attempt by Jacobites to seize Edinburgh Castle on the 8th of September 1715 because they had dispensed with the original plan, which was a coordinated rising on the 15th of September 1715. Clan leaders such as the Earls of Huntly and MacDonald of Glengarry mobilised their men slowly, and Cameron of Lochiel felt inhibited from raising any men at all, given his proximity to Fort William. Ordinary clansmen resented being dragged off to war during the harvest, and the men they managed to raise were supplied with the private arms at the personal expense of the landed elite, and as such, supplies were limited. This stood in contrast to the Hanoverian regiments, which were composed of hardened and well-trained and experienced veterans from the Spanish War of Succession, who were armed from the military resources of the British state, with their wages paid by the British Treasury. The British state also had the Royal Navy, and its constant patrolling of British waters restricted the movement of supplies and men from France to Britain. Further military problems for the Jacobites revealed themselves at the Battle of Sheriffmuir on the 13th of November 1715. There was a disconnect between the Lowland and Highland regiments due to the different ways they conducted warfare. Furthermore, there was a language barrier between the English speakers and the Highlanders who spoke Scottish Gaelic. These men were also cold, hungry, and not in the best condition to go to battle. After the Battle of Sheriffmuir, the Jacobite rank and file deserted in their droves. The Hanoverians, sensing weakness, were hell-bent on victory. However, a Jacobite army composed of both Highlanders and Lowlanders did manage to cross the English border on the 1st of November 1715 and headed towards Preston. The Jacobites entered the town, but scouts loyal to the Hanoverian regime quickly informed the Hanoverian army, and it was decided by the Hanoverian command to immediately attack. The Hanoverians successfully blockaded the city. English Jacobites lost their nerve, and Preston soon capitulated to the Hanoverian forces. The 1715 rising in Scotland was doomed, despite the large number of Scots, possibly as much as 20,000, joining the Jacobite side. Secchi states that the rising's failure was due to the poor leadership of the Earl of Mar, who lacked military experience. Mar had spent too much time languishing in Perth, waiting for French support, which never came, and this contributed to the Jacobites' defeat at Sheriffmuir on the 13th of November 1715. So, what was the role of France in all of this? And why, after the 1715 rising, had the Franco-British relationship taken a turn for the worse? France had been the major supporter of the Jacobite movement and the exiled Stuart royal family since the family were deposed in the Revolution in 1688. The Stuart royal family had lived in Saint-Germain-en-Laye with the blessing of King Louis XIV. Interestingly, Louis XIV and King James II, King James III's father, were in fact cousins. Despite the cynicism within the French government felt towards the Jacobite cause, they gave support to the Jacobites in 1689 to 1696 and in 1708. During this time, France had planned and prepared multiple invasion forces. French forces had landed in Ireland in 1690 and French fleets had made their way to Scotland in 1708. So French help for the Jacobite cause was a reality and the Hanoverian regime could not ignore it. Louis XIV died in September 1715, 3 months before King James III landed in Scotland. At that time the Jacobites had a now or never attitude when it came to the cause, and France saw it as an opportunity to intervene in British affairs for the benefit of France. The rising dominance of Britain in Europe and its growing global empire was a key motivation for France to support the Jacobite cause. Indeed, one of the key questions is whether the French genuinely supported the Jacobite cause or whether the French were using the Jacobites for their own ends. The French promised 20,000 troops, but this promise never materialised, and this did contribute to the failure of the rebellion. In addition, Mar had halted his army at Perth, whilst waiting for the Duke of Berwick, who was a naturalised Frenchman, Marshal of France, and King James II's illegitimate son, to arrive, but the Duke of Berwick did not appear, fearing displeasure from French royal circles. When King James III landed in Peterhead on the 22nd of December 1715, he had a small war chest and a small unit of bodyguards. It was certainly not the French support that the Jacobites were expecting. Meldrum in the Garde Ecossaise is resident in Paris. He therefore knew the likely outcome of the rebellion, and in the novel he is hinting at a possible reconciliation between Hanoverian Britain and France. Our narrator, Robert Meldrum, openly declares to the reader,
"I am neither Whig nor Jacobite."
Whether you believe him or not, I will leave it up to you, but he is trying to convince the reader of his neutrality. What did it mean to be a Whig? What did it mean to be a Jacobite? The politics of Britain in the early 18th century was dominated by these two factions, which were reflected in the political parties that had already emerged in England and Scotland before the Act of Union in 1707. The Jacobites were commonly known as Tories, and broadly speaking, they supported the exiled Stuart royal family. The Whigs were Hanoverian. The Hanoverians had assumed the throne in 1714 after the death of Queen Anne. The Tories were largely associated with the English and Scottish aristocracy, and those quietly loyal to the exiled royal house of Stuart. The English Tories were associated with the Church of England, or the Anglican Church. Tories were more likely to be High Anglicans, those members of the Church of England who put an emphasis on religious ceremony and bishops. English Tories also included English aristocrats who were Catholic. In Scotland, a similar development had taken place as Scottish Tories gravitated towards Scottish episcopacy, and like their English Tory counterparts, they believed in the place of bishops and ceremonies within the Church of Scotland. Episcopalians believed that the monarch should have some say on how the church is governed. Yet, in contrast to England, the monarch was not the head of the church. Episcopalians were major supporters of the Jacobite cause, particularly during the 1715 rebellion. Like England, Scottish Catholics gravitated towards the Tory party as their natural allies. By way of contrast, the Whig party, broadly speaking, were drawn from minor landowners and the middle classes who had risen in wealth through enterprise and global trade. The Whigs were also dominated by lawyers. English Whigs in particular believed in the sanctity of English common law and English parliamentary liberties. For English Whigs, the English Parliament was at the centre of the English constitution and not the monarchy. In terms of religion, the Whigs were dominated by Protestant dissenters or low Anglicans within the Church of England, who believed in a church without bishops or ceremonies. Low Anglican and dissenter church services were dominated by sermons. Many worshipped in their own church services and were split into various groups, including Baptists, Quakers and Presbyterians. They had been advocates of the revolution in 1688, which had disinherited King James II from the throne. They viewed James II's deposition as a necessary step to defend the parliamentary and religious liberties against a creeping and dangerous Catholicism. At worst, the exiled Stuarts were seen as agents of this Catholic threat, evidenced by the fact that the exiled Stuart court was resident in Catholic France. In Scotland, the Whigs were dominated by the sons of Covenanters and staunch Presbyterians who had been persecuted during the reigns of Charles II and James II. Some of these Whigs had been resident at the court of William of Orange, the Dutch stadtholder, before he deposed James II in the Glorious Revolution in 1688, and who subsequently became King William III of Britain and Ireland. Hence why Meldrum tries to assure English Protestant readers that although he has lived in France for many years, he is still a confirmed Protestant, and here's a spoiler alert, at heart anyway. We will revisit these political and religious fault lines throughout the novels, so it is best to introduce them at this early stage. Meldrum alludes to the communities in both nations in our native lands who love both the land of their birth and their exiled communities. Here Meldrum is talking about French immigrant communities in Britain and Ireland, as well as immigrant communities in France. These immigrant communities could be found at all levels of society and in several professions. For now, I will give a brief overview. The French could be found at the top of British society. Queen Henrietta Maria of Britain and Ireland, wife of King Charles I, was the sister of King Louis XIII of France, and in fact she met King Charles I, the then Prince of Wales, in Paris in 1623, and in 1624 a treaty was drawn up between Britain and France. As part of this treaty, Prince Charles was to be married to the French princess, Henrietta Maria. Between 1624 and 1625, Prince Charles sent a stream of love letters across the Channel to his prospective bride, exuding romantic words and genuine excitement about the forthcoming marriage. Unfortunately, the marriage was delayed due to the French and British arguing over the position of the Catholic faith in Britain. It was illegal to practice Catholic Mass in Britain, and the Catholic Church held on to the Pope's dispensation for the marriage until changes in British law were made. However, with Prince Charles's father, King James I of Britain and Ireland, dying, King Louis XIII recognised the urgency of the situation and decreed that if the papal dispensation for the marriage did not arrive in 30 days, the marriage would go ahead regardless. King James I, who was already extremely ill, died soon after Louis XIII gave his approval for the marriage. Due to King Charles I's ascension to the British and Irish thrones, the marriage ceremony took place at Notre Dame in 1625 without the groom. In fact, the marriage between Henrietta Maria and King Charles I took place by proxy, with the Duke of Chevreuse standing in for King Charles I. As historian Katie Whittaker succinctly puts it, Henrietta was now queen of a country she had never seen, whose language she did not speak. Despite British admiration for French culture, for most of King Charles I's reign, Henrietta Maria was viewed with deep suspicion from English Protestants, who wished to reform the Church of England further. These people were known as Puritans. They regarded the Pope as the Antichrist, bent on destroying the Protestant religion in Britain, and they also regarded Queen Henrietta Maria as a willing agent for the papacy's plans to bring Britain back into the bosom of the Catholic Church. The French also had diplomatic communities in Britain at this time. There were several French diplomats sent to Britain during the 17th century. These diplomats often came with their own staff from their own countries, and it was a self-contained community. There were also many French people to be found as traders who emigrated to Britain, and most famously amongst these were the Huguenots. The Huguenots were French Protestants who settled in London, Norwich, and in the Midlands. But they also settled in Ireland, around Dublin and in Ulster. Their skills were essential to the development of the textile industries such as lace, linen and Norwich crepe, which was a silk gauze created by the Huguenot community in the city. The Huguenots in London also contributed heavily to the development of watchmaking and the silversmith industries in Britain. We also have to consider the groups of French soldiers that came to Ireland during the Jacobite Wars. Conversely, French Huguenots who had settled in Britain after fleeing France supported William of Orange in the same war, so both French Catholics and French Huguenots were fighting against each other in Ireland. Likewise in France, there were British communities to be found in all levels of French society. The Stuart royal family spent periods of time in France as exiles, most notably King Charles II and King James II. It was natural, given the execution of his father, King Charles I, that Charles II should go to France to be with his mother, Henrietta Maria, a princess of France, and his brother, James, Duke of York. However, due to a treaty that Cardinal Mazarin made with Oliver Cromwell in the mid-1650s, the Stuart exiled court's French connections were curtailed, and the court then resided in the Spanish Netherlands, where Charles II was forced to try and gain the support from the court of Spain. The second major period of Stuart exile in France was from 1688 to 1718, when Louis XIV of France allowed King James II and his successors, who had fled Britain after the Dutch invasion of William of Orange, to settle in Saint-Germain-en-Laye. Louis XIV was the first cousin of both Charles II and James II. The Stuarts and the Bourbons were a close family. Louis XIV, Charles II and James II grew to know Louis XIV and the French court during the 1650s. It was not just the British Stuart kings that came to live in France, but their royal courts moved with them too. These exiled courts functioned as proper royal courts, projecting the monarch's authority abroad. There was a king's council with chosen aristocrats who held key offices of state, and a king's household, just as they would have done so in Britain. Both Charles II's court and James II's court were seen as threats to the established British and Irish governments at the time. Whether that be the English Republic under Oliver Cromwell in the 1650s, or the Williamite governments of the 1680s and 1690s. The threat from these exiled royal courts should not be underestimated. The Jacobite courts in the later 17th and early 18th centuries cast a permanent shadow over the Williamite and early Hanoverian Britain. Just as there were French diplomats resident in England, there were British diplomats resident in France, with their own embassies and staff. Henry Rich, Lord Kensington, was the ambassador to France from 1623 to 1624, and he was tasked with facilitating the treaty which led to the marriage between Princess Henrietta Maria and Prince Charles, later King Charles I. Sir George Goring was then sent over to Paris to complete the marriage articles, and brought a letter over from King Louis XIII to King James I at the time of King James I's death in March 1625. George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, was then sent over to Paris to meet Queen Henrietta Maria and take her to London. This latter journey may be vaguely familiar to you, as Alexandre Dumas used the embassy of the Duke of Buckingham as inspiration for a storyline in The Three Musketeers, where the musketeers are dispatched to collect the jewels that the Queen of France had given to Buckingham. Whereas in Britain there were communities of French residents and exiles who contributed to industry in Britain, there were British communities in France that facilitated trade between the two countries. Most notably, for our purposes, many Scottish merchants traded in wine and brandy from Bordeaux. Wine could not be bought, but was exchanged with goods from Britain, including cloth and fish. The Irish also traded in wine from France in the 17th century. And throughout the centuries, English traders traded in French wine, leading to the evolution of wine production in the Médoc region near Bordeaux. There was also a significant number of British and Irish Catholics living in France. The proximity of France to Britain meant that France became a natural haven for Catholics from Britain and Ireland, who had to flee persecution as practising Mass was still illegal in the 17th century. There were also communities of clerics that taught at the Catholic colleges in France. These colleges acted as schools for older male pupils and universities giving students skills for life. Some of these male students would have become priests, but after the Protestant Reformation, Catholics were prohibited from attending British universities. As a result, these institutions became educational establishments for the sons of the leading Catholic gentry in Britain and Ireland. Colleges were organised by nationality. There was an English college in France for members of the English gentry, Scots colleges in France for the sons of Scottish gentry, and Irish colleges for members of the Irish gentry. An English college was located in Douai. Scots colleges were to be found at Douai and Paris, and there were Irish colleges in Bordeaux, Toulouse and Paris. There were also Scottish, Irish and English soldiers serving in the French armies during the 17th century, particularly during the 30 Years' War. We see this in the Garde Ecossaise novels when John Hamilton joins French forces in 1643. However, there was also well-established regiments that formed part of the French king's bodyguard from Scotland, England and Ireland. Of course, our novel The Garde Ecossaise is most closely associated with the Scottish Guard. Our group of men are clearly fictitious, but the regiment is not. The regiment was founded in the Middle Ages, but had become smaller in size by the 1600s. It was essentially Scottish men-in-arms on loan to the King of France from the King of Britain, and as such, when France and Britain were on different sides in a war, loyalty in these Scottish, English and Irish regiments could easily become conflicted and painful for those serving. In the 1670s, Louis XIV consolidated these regiments into a British brigade, which upset the Irish deeply because they did not see themselves as British. In future podcasts, we will delve into these Franco-British and Franco-Irish communities in greater detail. I hope you have enjoyed this podcast. Just a reminder that the historical fiction novel La Garde Ecossaise is available in all good bookstores. If any of these topics in this podcast have interested you today, and you would like to know a little bit more, further resources, including recommended reading, websites, digital resources, and social media, can be found at www.lagardeecossaise.net. These resources have been organised by podcast and by reading order in the novels. I look forward to joining you again next week for this next episode of La Garde Ecossaise podcast, where we will explore religious controversy and war in 17th century Scotland. Until then, au revoir, à bientôt. The voice of Robert Meldrum is provided by Gaz Kerr. The sound effects are provided by the following: P. Franzen, ambient battle, noise, swords and shouting at Freesound. Marco Mann, 89, quill pen writing on hard paper at various speed at Freesound. Inez, parliament noises at Freesound. Le Abbé, Norlac, Market 2 at Freesound. Barre Dowell, Porto Better at Freesound. The theme music is provided by Ionics Music.
This podcast is the copyright of History Gateway Limited, UK.